It's still 1270 in the Shire, and I'm looking at the rest of the families, the ones that live in the East Farthing and Buckland. There are 3 families, Baggins, Bulgar and Brandybark, and for each of the 3, life was very different. The East Farthing had always been a very quiet, sleepy area, very much mired in the past. It's a place that resists change even more than the rest of the Shire. That could be because of their proximity to the Brandywine Bridge. It might forge a link with the past that the rest of the Shire doesn't have. Whatever the reason, they're very sleepy. The only change we're seeing is in the Boffin household, and the Boffins, given the lives of their descendants from this point, are associating more with great smiles. The East Farthing doesn't have any money. I don't know when the East Farthing ever did have money. But all the families there are falling into a sort of genteel poverty. Whatever they have, whatever prestige or influence, has come from the past. It's not because of the way their households are performing now. They have no current influence in the running of the Shire, neither financially or socially. They don't seem to have any association with Gandalf, who we know is a good friend of Gerontius Tooks, and therefore will be coming to great smiles in this era. And I don't even know how much they associate with Gerontius. I'd say Gerontius has some communication with Brandy Hall. Buckland is outside the Shire, so it's really a sort of neighbourly, polite, diplomatic contact. It might therefore be a bit more formal. I guess what I'm saying here is, with all the innovation and forward movement that I talked about in the last video, these guys are not seeing any of that. These guys are seeing the sun on the fields, the slow flow of a calm Brandywine river, gentle rains. They walk in the laneways, the children pick flowers, they hear the birds in the trees. The established families of the regions are probably still inviting all the neighbours to banquets. I imagine they're having morning teas and they're chatting to each other whenever they go out. But there's none of that drive and innovation and education and creativity that we're seeing over at Great Smiles. As I said before, it's a sleepy community. I don't think it's quite so sleepy over at Buckland as it is in the East Farthing. I think over at Buckland they're starting to see hints of discontent out in the greater world. Buckland in this era, I think, is so short on money that even the general populace is affected by it. I don't suppose they're really thinking of it that way because there never was much money there. I'd say in Buckland it's just become a matter of virtue that you recycle rather than get something new, that you eke every last bit of use out of every item that you pick up. If they do that, they're still living well, they're still living happily. They've got food, they've got shelter, they've got company. But it's nothing like what you would see if you went to Great Smiles. Of course, they don't go to Great Smiles, so they don't see that. That said, the 3 families I'm going to talk about here probably do visit Great Smiles occasionally. Enough at least that they're not completely out of the world of the hobbits that live there. And they're moving ahead with the times nearly as much as their West Farthing friends. But it is a very different community. This might seem odd, but I'm going to start with the Bulgars. A lot of the details about the Bulgar tree, especially from this generation on, I've got from the Tolkien Gateway website. I'll put a link to it here and at the end of the video. I believe that back in the day of Gundolfo Bulgar, this family was rich and influential. I don't know why, I don't know what brought them their wealth, but at that time they had a very dignified estate and seemingly all the money in the world. Gundolfo had plenty to pass on to his 3 sons. My next guess is that he divided his wealth equally among all 3. There was plenty of it, nobody was going to notice this. And as well as a third of the wealth, the eldest son inherited the Bulgar property. The other 2 lived either in the same estate or somewhere nearby. And when the 3rd generation was born, that money was eventually passed on to them. In 1270, Edelgar's father is still alive, but he's a very old man. He's about to turn 100 and he's not going to live for very much longer. So in 1270, I'm pretty sure Edelgar's father is a retired man on the property. And while he might nominally own and control everything still, it's Edelgar who is doing all the work around the place. The common system that I've talked about over and over. But this third of the Bulgar wealth that is going to come down to Edelgar through his father is not actually the wealth that it seemed. Not in the modern world, when things maybe cost more than they used to. Or perhaps the Bulgar family has just lived beyond their means for too long. Since wealth comes from outside the Shire, unless they're actively producing something that they can sell outside the Shire, like the Hornblowers are in the South Farthing, or they're going out having adventures of their own, as Tolkien tells us the Took family occasionally did, they're not getting any money. They're just living on the wealth of Edelgar's grandfather Gundolfo, and it's beginning to run out. Edelgar's father dies in 1275, after which Edelgar is the Bulgar in charge of the estate. We know nothing about the way he ran it. He did fairly well because he had 2 sons and a daughter. But the grandfather had 3 sons. That suggests to me that the grandfather was wealthy and powerful. Edelgar's father performed adequately but didn't increase the family wealth at all. Edelgar therefore has a slightly tougher job ahead of him, managing whatever is left and trying to rein back excess expenses. I don't know exactly how it worked, but the fortunes of Bridgefield and the Yale, and the fortunes of the Marish, which is further south again, all seem to be tied up with the fortunes of Buckland. It's entirely possible that they were producing crops that Buckland was purchasing. So given I'm thinking Buckland is running out of money at this time, and I think there's a fair bit of evidence buried in the names of the characters in the tree that this is the case, this might be an example of Buckland's financial straits infiltrating outward to the lesser families that rely on them. Edelgar's quite a decent manager, but they're used to being the prominent family in the district. And they're still living as if they are. So we've got 3 children, Rudigar, Rudibert and Rudy. They're growing up in luxurious surroundings. I imagine their place is grand. Big burrows with mahogany beams. They haven't really been raised to budget. They're going to do it, but they haven't been raised to it. And as they grow up, they're not aware of economics, so they're imagining that they're going to be living exactly the same lifestyle as their father and their grandfather and their great-grandfather. It's probably when they reach their teens that they realise that's not the case. They're in the modern world enough to see the difference between Great Smiles and their own place. They might see it more clearly than anyone else, if I'm right about the grandeur in their own home, because they won't be overawed by the grandeur in Great Smiles. They'll see that for what it is, as a backdrop to the way people are really living. And they'll see that the way people are really living is different. So I imagine this is what influences Rudigar as he grows up. He's educated, but he's educated traditionally by his father and his grandfather. I'd say he spent some time at Great Smiles. I think this is something Gerontius did. He encouraged the eldest sons at least of all the important families to come there, which kept all the important families of the Shire a cohesive unit. It's a clever thing to do, but Gerontius was that clever. He was also a friend of Gandalf, who was cleverer still. At this point, there's not much more to say about Rudigar. He's received some education and maybe been influenced a little by Gerontius. There's also a weight of tradition for him to maintain. Plus there's a need to bring the Bulgars into the modern world. They're a little bit distant geographically to many of the other families in the tree. So I can see them with their own ponies riding all over the place. It's a logical way for them to stay in contact with everybody around them. It's very logical for these children to go and stay at Brandy Hall. It's extra likely because these guys are first cousins, through Marmaduke being married to Edeldreda. There's going to be a lot of comings and goings between the 2 households. There was a little bit of gossip I snipped before about Gorbadoc Brandybuck and how many people he had staying in Brandy Hall. The place was loaded with guests, and that didn't change however poor their finances were. It was probably more important now that they did it than ever, because at some point they might need to call in some favours. And that's it for Rudigar. I think he associated most with Gorbadoc over at Brandy Hall, who was his first cousin and the same age. I see him as a very friendly, very kind person, although maybe somebody who is a little bit pompous, a little bit aware of his own dignity, but a truly nice person. So now I'll move on to Rudibert. I've got even less to say about Rudibert. He's here, second son. Rudibert has children who are going to stay vaguely relevant to the tree going forward, so I'm going to keep him in. I would imagine once he's married he doesn't move out. He settles in the Bolger estate with all the other extended families. Looking at his descendants, there's nothing there that links him to the West Farthing in any way, so I don't think he went to Great Smiles all that much. I think his entire life is spent in the East Farthing near Budgeford. At this point, he's just the middle child in the family growing up with the others. Ruby. Ruby was the youngest in her family and the only daughter. But she was one of that massive bunch of baby hobbits that were all born at once. She's the same age as both Bingo and Fosco Baggins. She's also the same age as one of the unnamed Brandy girls. It's a real pity that girl wasn't named, because I would imagine that she and Ruby were very close. They're first cousins, they're the same age. They're in a rather small social circle, and they're in families that I think were visiting each other quite regularly. There is very little about Ruby in the books. Not even the usual glancing mentions, which surprises me, because she is an important part of this genealogy. I'd have expected some hobbit somewhere to mention her. So from this, basically this lack of information, I'm interpreting her as a quiet girl who likes to spend time on her own, in the garden, going on walks. Tolkien says all hobbits have an affinity to nature. I think she's one who was particularly attuned to it. I see her as a daydreamer. I also see her as one who is as aware as her brothers of the changing fortunes of the Bolgers. And that despite this illustrious history and elegant surroundings, they don't hold the place that maybe they once did. So she places more importance on friendship and kindness and virtues like that rather than things. It's absolutely a stretch to assume such things about her just because Tolkien rarely mentions her. But if you look at how he treats the virtuous women in his stories, that's how he did it. Even Arwen through The Lord of the Rings had very little said about her. The ones he spent more time with were the ones who in his mind were doing the wrong things, like Éowyn. I personally think he gravitated to her more than the others, but his conscious mind, his deliberate intention, was that Arwen was the true heroine, and he said very little about her. So my radical extrapolation here is that Ruby stayed under the radar because she was keeping it real in the world. She's a very natural sort of person. She's a good friend. She's kind-hearted. She's honest. And she's likely the best support you can have if you need help. There's actually not much more I can say about her. I think, like the boys, she rode ponies. She was out there playing with everybody, at least in her early years, and when she grew to adulthood and it wasn't seemly for her to do that anymore, I'd say she was a very considerate hostess, very helpful, still very caring. There's really not much else to say about her at this point until we've talked about the other families. She'll come back into it later. Fosco Baggins. Fosco was the only child of Largo. As I said before, I'm placing him in a little shop in Whitfurrow. I said in a previous video that I felt the relationship between Largo and Tanta soured somewhat. I still hold to that, but we're only talking about a Tolkien-style souring of the relationship. Tolkien's characters, when they got married the right person, loved each other very much. The marriage was supportive and they could live together comfortably for the rest of their lives. This I'm pretty sure held with Largo and Tanta, even in my imaginings, because really they were very similar. Even if my suppositions were actually true, that they each wanted something they didn't have and that their way of achieving that was to marry each other, that's a philosophy of life that's going to hold them together into the future. And they're both good people. They're both nice people. So I think that once they settled into the business of actually living and recognised that their daydreams were not real life, I think they did pretty well. Also, I think at some point they packed up their little shop and moved over to Brandy Hall. I think that that's where Fosco grew up. Maybe he was about 10 or 12 when they did this. But there came a time when Largo was living in Brandy Hall with Marmaduke in the same way that Mungo was living in Great Smiles with Gerontius. And whatever Largo did over there at Brandy Hall, whether he had some kind of independent business or whether Marmaduke employed him as an agent or some such in the hall, I have no idea. There is absolutely nothing in his tree that gives any clues to that. But I do think at some point, after Fosco was born, that's where they ended up. So Fosco, I think, is growing up with Gorbadoc and Augulus. He is educated with them, he has adventures with them, and unlike the other Baggins children, Fosco is still fishing and rowing boats and bathing in the river, because the Brandybucks are doing this, so he is doing this with them. He's an only child, but because of this, he's not growing up alone. He did, however, spend several years alone before he went there, and I do think that's the case. I do think there's a difference in the way children see the world when they've been rather isolated as a child and come into a group of others maybe in their teen years. They're that bit more independent. They're that bit more inclined to spend time in their own heads. I think that holds even for gregarious children. So I imagine him growing up with the others, but also taking time by himself and going on his walks in the country alone and going fishing alone and talking to a large number of people and spending a lot of time daydreaming in his head, which I think is extra likely because he's got Largo and Tanta as parents who in different ways are both dreamers. He's inherited a large portion of this and he's grown up listening to them, continuing to talk grand schemes and grand ideas, think innovatively about their position and think of ways to change what they're doing and ways to improve it. He's growing up with a lot of optimism. And as well as growing up with Gorbadoc and Augulus and the two girls, he's growing up with the Bolga children because they're coming over a lot. And that's the group. We've got Gorbadoc and Augulus and the two girls, Rudigar, Rudibert and Ruby, and we've got Fosco. The 8 of them growing up together. So I think Fosco was somewhat of a dreamer like his parents, but because he saw that it didn't really work out for them, he understands that there are limits based on what resources you have, what network you have, and what skills you have. And being a bit more grounded in that way, I think he's more inclined to value what he sees in other people. He values honesty and courage and responsibility and creativity. And I imagine he's happy just to have that around him. He's not hankering after wealth. He doesn't feel any need for a prestigious job to have a specific place in society. All he wants is a comfortable life with the right people around. I imagine he went to Great Smiles at times, because he is Mungo's nephew after all, but I'm not convinced that he liked it there much. He's not an urban hobbit at all. I don't think that drive and innovation would have suited him. I think he would have felt that was missing the point of life. I think to Fosco, the past had its place, and the space to think and appreciate what you have meant more than change. There's not really anything else to say about him now. That's how I see him. That's how I see him grow up. He's in Brandy Hall. He doesn't mind being poor. The important takeaway is I think he is a good, kind, intelligent, but unambitious hobbit who is now living in Brandy Hall. I'll finish this video with the Brandybucks. Of the 4 children born to Marmaduke and Adeldreda, we only need to look at 2, Gorbadoc and Augulus. And of those 2, Gorbadoc is the only one who's going to stay strongly in the tree from here on. Gorbadoc is the eldest son. He's grown up with his siblings and his Bolga cousins, and I think also Fosco Baggins. He's the exact same age as Rollo Boffin, but I don't think they had anything to do with each other. I think Gorbadoc's chief companion was probably Rudigar Bolga. I see him as a different personality to his father. Marmaduke was a very friendly soul, I think, ready to take things as it came and make the best of what has to be made the best of. Gorbadoc, I suspect, is a more serious character, maybe a little more like his grandfather Maddock, although not so stoic and not so habit-bound either. I would say Gorbadoc is sterner. He's living in a different world to his father. There are more privations than there were, not that that's really impacting them, because it's the same for everybody around. He'd only notice it when he goes to visit Great Smiles, which I do think he does sometimes because Gerontius is encouraging at least the elder sons to come over. And it makes absolute sense for Gerontius to encourage Gorbadoc to be friends with his own sons so that relations stay good between the Shire and Buckland. I expect he grew up in the typical Brandy Buck way, with a whole lot of relatives around him, boating and fishing, swimming in the river, having little adventures by sneaking into the old forest every so often, which Tolkien tells us the Brandy Bucks did occasionally. I think added to this, he spent time with his cousins the Bolgars and with Fosco Baggins. I suspect his father took great care to train him properly as a future master of Buckland, and maybe even overdid it a little. Marmaduke threw himself into management of the place, I think, which is why he was known as masterful. But there's a bit of conflict there between the management style of Maddock, who is still in charge of Brandy Hall, and Marmaduke, who is a little more innovative but is restrained because he's not actually in charge. Gorbadoc sees the tension in this. Gorbadoc can take influences from the people around him because they are all starting to live very differently. When I talked in a few videos about the 7 hobbits by the riverside, you couldn't really tell that their lifestyles were different. They played well together, and even though some were rich, some were poor, all of that vanished when they were together doing the same things in the same times. Gorbadoc is seeing something quite different with the friends around him. He's seeing the Bolgars with their great respect for their past and the weight of tradition that's hanging around the Bolgar estate. He's seeing Fosco, whose parents are quite the opposite, forging new ways of doing things. And he's seeing both the best and the worst in the decisions that Maddock and Marmaduke make. He's seeing all this and he's thinking on it. At the same time, things are a little more unsettled away from the Shire. There would be stories coming from Bree. There would be the occasional stranger around, nothing like it is later on in the time of the Fellowship of the Ring, but there would be a person here or there travelling through who brings stories of unrest elsewhere. This is of far greater concern to Buckland than it is to the Shire proper, and I'd say Marmaduke impresses this on his son. So Gorbadoc is growing up with his own weight of future obligations. He also, in a different way, has a tough job before him because there's very little money in the Shire. His father is just sitting this out thinking, we've got to get through this tight patch and things will improve. Gorbadoc is looking at it all thinking, no, it's not going to improve. This is it. This is life. There's no money coming in from anywhere else. This is the future as well as the present. And more than that, the future might involve greater privations, less money, more problems. So he's got a very different view of the world. I'd say of all the hobbits, he's probably got the most pessimistic outlook. And it's not seriously pessimistic. He's not gloomy. But he is aware that the future isn't bright unless everybody around works hard to make it be. Beyond that, there's not many clues about him. I think his main associate was his cousin Rudigar Bolgar, who is the same age as him. Rollo Boffin is also the same age, but I don't think Rollo had anything to do with this group. I see him as being one of the people who spent a bit of time travelling the Shire with the Tooks, which I'll talk about more in the next video. But given the times, I'd say Marmaduke encouraged him to focus his attention on Brandy Hall even now as a child. In 1277, when Gorbadoc was 17 years old, his grandfather Maddock Brandybuck died. And after this, Marmaduke becomes master. This allows Marmaduke free rein to change any systems that he might have had to tolerate with Maddock still in charge. So I think at the age of 17, Gorbadoc had a chance to see what you could do if you are the master of a place, what alterations you can make to daily running and to the lifestyles of the Hobbit who are effectively under your care. So he grows up into this with a great sense of responsibility and a great awareness of the influence that he actually has to exert, an influence that's really only held back by lack of money at this point. Not that he sees a solution to that, but he's young. I imagine he's assessing everything, thinking at some point he's going to hit on the solution. So that's how I see him, a more solemn hobbit than some of the others. Definitely a responsible one. A kindly soul, good friends with them all, and as we know from that bit of gossip later on, he's highly hospitable. He has many hobbits there at all times. And I think that starts now too. All of these hobbits attached to Buckland and the East Farthing are more grounded in community and personality than they are in affluence and things. I know I've said that over and over, but I think in their different ways, this group of hobbits have all come to that same point, which keeps them a united group going on into adulthood, and also gives them a very different view of the world to the ones over in Great Smiles. There's little else I can say about Gorbadoc here. Augulus. Even less to say about Augulus. He is 8 years younger than his elder brother. He vanishes from the tree after this. We do know his son's name, his grandson, and so on. Some of his descendants will be mentioned down the track. I'm not going to follow them directly, but it's worth remembering his name. Augulus is here as the brother of Gorbadoc. And that's really all I can say. I'm going to leave this video in the year 1277 with the death of Maddock Brandy Buck. When I move on to the next one about the Tooks, I'll jump back a little bit in time again. But the point at which we return to 1277, to Maddock's funeral, that is where parts 5, 6 and 7 converge. So from 1277 in the next video, I'm just proceeding with this whole giant bunch together. And because of that, this is where I'm going to leave it. 1277 in the Shire. Thank you for watching.